Hi, I'm Angela, a watercolor artist, and I love painting florals. Today, we are kicking off our Valentine's Day series, and I've got 3 paintings that we'll be painting over the 3 sessions, which will be divided into 3 videos. Today, we are presenting the first video in the series, and all the 3 videos are based on painting roses and creating compositions around roses. Today we are going to paint this simple and elegant rose wreath in the form of a heart. If you are somebody considering painting roses, this is definitely a video for you because we are starting off with the simplest form of roses as we've painted it today. We'll get into the video, and as you paint along, you'll be able to grasp a lot of the basics and be able to create the roses just like these. Let's get into the video. First off, we will see what supplies we need for this painting. The supplies I'm using today for this painting is Winsor & Newton watercolor cakes. I find this palette to be really helpful because it's got, I think, 18 different shades, and they're all covering all the primary colors, and they also have some secondary colors. It's a really good investment, I feel. For brushes, I'm using a set from the brand Artify. So they sent me over their collection, and all of these brushes are really good in this painting. So I'll be using, I think, the dagger brush or the flat brush, the angular brush and the round brush, and also the fine liner brush from the set today. And finally, the most important part of this is the watercolor paper. So I am using the Arches 300 GSM 100% pure watercolor cold pressed paper. So it got a slight texture. I don't know if you can see it on the camera, but this is the slightly grained texture paper that I'm using. Please be mindful to try and use a good paper for this watercolor. So I'm starting off taking off the angular brush. You can use any brushes indeed. So this is the first time I'm trying to use a different kind of brush apart from the round brush. So I'm just using it everywhere, to be honest. So I'm picking up the red shade that I'm trying to use for my roses today. So what I do is I pick up the paint and I put it off on the palette and adjust the consistency of it. So I'm taking a really light shade for the base. We start with the base. So you can see it's a very light shade. I've added so much of water, and I'm going to put like a circular shape. So I'll start with a circular shape first and then wiggle my brush around to have that petal effect. So it looks like the petals are outside. I don't want it to be very symmetrical, but just a random shape. And then I'm picking up the very same shade and dropping it in the middle and at the edges. For that, I'm using the very sharp edge of the angle brush. So do this when the surface is still wet so that it just spreads and diffuses on its own. This is also called as the wet on wet technique. So as I let it to dry, what I will do now is to mix the next shade that I'm going to use. For this, I'm going to take a little more deeper shade. I think I'm using a maroonish shade, mixing it with the same red, and then going to add in a little bit more depth at the center. So that's how it looks now. Not much of a difference from what was there earlier, but still I've got some kind of a definition at the center now, and I'm satisfied with it. I let it dry for now, and next when we go in for the next stroke, we are going to do it on the dry surface. So I mix in a little bit more darker shade, and the darker shade I have had a little bit of black mixed in earlier. So that's a tiny bit of black and lots of red, and then I'm going to add in the details at the center. So remember, when you add the details, not to just cover everything what you have done earlier, okay? You should not mask every layer that you have painted earlier, but you should add to the layer. So remember to always go in small strokes and build it up. So I'm kind of satisfied with the way the flower looks now, and I'm going to add the leaves, for which I'm going to take the parrot green color. And as in the earlier method, you're going to have a light base first. So I'm using very diluted water, water the pigment down so really well, and then paint the leaves. So I'm just going to show you how you can use a round brush as well for the leaves. So if I have a flat brush, I get that flat surface immediately along the edge of the flower. But then if I have a round brush, I need to draw that as well. So I'm just trying to explain the different shapes of leaf. You can have a straight leaf, or you can have like a tilted leaf. So just try whichever works well for you and how you can do it better. So as I said, when it is still wet, just drop in a bit darker shade and then let it diffuse. And the next layer, that is the third layer we'll put in, will be when it has completely dried. So until we wait for it to dry, we'll start with the third element that we want to practice today, and that is going to be our branches. So I don't want the branch to have the same shade as my leaves, so I'm mixing a little bit of brown and then drawing the branches. If you see what I'm doing, there are two different things I'm keeping in mind. One is that my brush is really dry. I don't want too much of pigment. And second is I'm using the really end, the edge, the sharp tip of my brush to get that really sharp branches. And I'm wiggling it a bit, pressing it a bit at some locations to have a lot of detail and character to the branches. So this is a practice, and we'll get into the final painting right now. Having your practice before you start your actual painting gets you to warm up your strokes and your hands and your colors. So always remember to do your practice before you start your main work. Well, so today we're going to do the wreath in the form of a heart, as I already showed you. So I'm going to draw a wreath shape with my pencil. I really like to have an outline lightly done on my paper so that I have all the elements within the same shape that I intend it to be. So going in back in this very same procedure that we did, I have my red. I'm bringing the pigments down by adding a lot of water and then wiggling the brush and then making a circular form first and then just adding a little bit of curved edges like, it's a petal. I like to do several of these base layers together, but then make sure that it doesn't dry off faster. So depending on your paper, whether you have your fan on, whether you're painting outside, your flowers and whatever you're painting might dry faster or slower. So have a look out for that and then keep adding in the second layer as soon as you think it's going to get dried up. All right. So here we have the second layer, which was the bit more darker pigment I've added at the center and also few at the edges. And now it looks okay. I'm going to add in the rest of the flowers. And since this is not a circle, I can't really have a symmetric way of doing things. So I'm just placing it at equal distance. So there's 3 on the left and 3 on the right, but both of them are not symmetrical. I think it looks more natural that way. Well, so I'm going to wait for the first layer to dry and I'll pick up the greens and start the leaves. For the position of the leaves, the first layer, I'm going to go in with 2 leaves. Okay, so what I want to do is to have the wreath shape as well. So I'll go and put in 2 leaves on either sides of the flower, kind of roughly aligning with the outline that I've made. Some of the leaf might be a bit outside, a bit inside, but almost along the lines that I have made. And then at the second stage, I will add in more leaves or more branches and whatever. So this is going to be like my first set of leaves. So the base layer is done, and immediately when it's wet, I have to add in the next layer so that it just, diffuses on its own and it has that nice gradient. So I just drop in the paint at the edge where the flower is there. So that's where probably the leaf is emerging from behind the flower, and it's got that deeper color, and then probably somewhere at the edges. So I'm done with that and I have to wait for it to dry. So I'm thinking I'll add the next layer in the flower because the flower is dry now. So as you practice, you will get used to which is the most efficient way of doing things. So I remember the first time when I used to paint, I used to just leave it for half an hour and then let it dry and then come back. So painting used to take a lot of time for me, but now I'm kind of more efficient this way that I know which is the dry surface, which is the wet surface, and when to paint what. So yes, so coming back, the leaves are wet, so be careful not to smudge the leaves while you're painting the center of the flower now. So I've mixed up a little bit darker red and I think a little bit more of brown to make it a little deeper. And then I'm going in and adding the details. So remember, you already have a darker center. You wouldn't want to cover that entire center with a new shade, but you have to leave some of the space and gaps in between so that you have all the 3 shades showing. The first, the lightest wash, the center that you put in wet on wet center, and now the dry brush stroke. So I need to see all the three shades. It has to come out through, only then you will have the details coming up, the depth coming up. So remember not to mask each layer, all right? So you just need to reduce, or how do I say, control the pressure you put on your brush so that the amount of area that your brush covers is just enough to add detail but not cover the entire of your base layer. All right, so the next task is to add the branches, and branches is something I am going to use to define the shape of the heart. So as I said earlier, mixing in a little bit of brown so that I have a different shade for the branch, that it shouldn't look similar to the leaves, isn't it? So I'm adding a little bit of brown and then doing the branches. So the branches are going to go kind of along the pencil outline that I have made, because the branches can go anywhere, isn't it? So this way I think I'm going to have like a outline of the heart kind of okayish. So I think, yeah, if you see at the left side, you can see that the heart shape has come out really well now. I'm going to go along the same line and add all the branches. So if you see, the branches have that texture because it is dry. So I'm not adding too much of water in the brown so that I get that dry texture, which is something I really like. So once I finish everything and I look from behind, I feel like there is a bit more gap after the branches have been put in, and I really don't have enough space to add in the same leaves because it might go off shape. So I'm going to have like a, normalize the width of the flower and the branch and the leaf all together. And for that, I'm adding in tiny, tiny leaves just to fill in all those gaps that I have. I think it's, I cannot really say how I do it because I think it's individual perspective. So when I look back from afar, I feel like there are certain places where there are gaps and I need some elements to be there. So maybe everyone's brain works differently. And if you see this painting now, you might still feel like there are gaps, or you might feel like the rose should have been placed someplace else. So it's depending upon every person's perception, you can tweak and change what you do. So the next thing I'm doing is to add a really light wash of leaves as a background. The reason I'm doing this, and the reason I do this to almost all my floral paintings, is essentially because when I paint something, I tend to go into very contrast shades. So if you see, my roses are really pigmented, the leaves are pigmented, and the background is white. So the white and the shade that I have, there's a lot of stark contrast. So I want to build up that gradient, for which I'm adding in really light washes of leaves to the background. So now it feels like, there's a step gradient. So there's a white, then there's a really light green, then you have the green, and then the red. So, there's that contrast is not as stark as it seemed earlier. Now everything is dry at this point, and I'm going to add in the last details. And this is just optional, okay? So I think you can leave it as such, but I just really like very bright florals and leaves. So what I'm doing here is I have taken the brightest and the darkest of the green and mixed in with the light green, and then I'm adding in the details. So I'm using a really thin brush. I think this is a fine liner brush I'm using. So if you can see in the leaves, I had the base wash and then I added in a shade when it was still wet. And now I'm adding in the dry strokes. So when I do that, I make sure that the other two shades are still visible in my leaves. That way I have more depth. So as I said, this step is completely optional and I don't go with any intentional strokes. I'm just randomly placing the shade somewhere. I'm not looking at the place where there's shadow or something like that. I just feel like it has to be at a place where you've already dropped in the darker shade, so it just creates a gradient. After I added the third layer in the leaves, I felt like something is missing in the flower. So I just feel like I need another more deeper tone in the flower. So I'm just going to mix up a little bit more of black and then adding a drop at the center. So it's just a dot and two strokes on left and the right. So I don't overdo the flower. So if you see, I've got the red, a dot, two lines. So that defines the extreme center of the flower, which is way deeper and there's kind of no light getting in. That's the whole idea. So that's the wreath, and what is left is to probably have some sentiment down there. And this is pretty optional, okay? So I'm a card maker and I love making cards. And so no painting is complete for me without I write any sentiment to go along, the feelings that go along with the card. As much as I love adding letters and sentiments to my cards and artwork, I also find that it's a little bit difficult, especially because the paper has a lot of texture. So anyways, I'm adding in a pencil outline to just make sure that what I want to write fits into the place and it is aligned properly, and I'll go over it with a pen. Sometimes I go over and under it, so that's just an outline to make sure that where I want to write, the space actually fits in what I want to write in. And I'm using a random gel pen and going in and writing what I want. And then in order to have that for effect of a calligraphy, I'm going in again and highlighting all the downstroke with a thicker line and then filling in the gaps. So this is how the final artwork looks like, and I hope you really like this. If you did, please don't forget to like, share and subscribe in this channel, and also leave me a feedback as to what you liked in this and what you did not. So I'm hoping that you would try this and you get a similar result. And if you don't, it's just a matter of practice. I assure you that it's just a matter of practice. And also remember to use a really good paper. So paper, I feel, is the make or break supply. The paint and the brush is still okay, but then depending on the type of paper I use, I can myself see that the result varies. So try to use a really good quality paper even when you're practicing. So see you with another video, and that is going to be the next one in the series of 3 that we have planned for on the theme of Valentine's Day. So see you then. Bye bye.